I'm Christian Escobar, the president of the Coronado Roundtable. So we do have coffee available. If you haven't had a chance and you want to, please help yourselves. And thank you all for coming this morning. We have another very interesting talk that will start in just a few minutes. But now that you're all comfortably seated, I'd like to have you stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
As you may know, our programs are recorded for Zoom. So I'd like to thank the Coronado Public Library for continuing to provide that service for us and for the community. And I'd like to ask that the Zoom audience mute their computer or device and please turn off their cameras. You may use the chat box function for the Q&A part of the program. And if you can't hear well at the back of the room, please let us know. And I'd like to thank Nick Burmeister, who's the master of the audiovisual presentation. And also the Coronado Roundtable would like to thank the Coronado Library Board of Trustees and the library staff for continuing to provide services here at the library for us to hold these programs and to consider us a sponsored organization in doing so. Our coffee is provided this morning by Alex of Amalo Brew. That's the coffee cart in front of the library. So we do ask for a $3 donation to be able to do that. This morning, we have a very topical program, one that's in the news continuously, and especially now with recent statewide actions. But before we move on to the main subject, let me inform you that our next program on August 23rd, we will have our local Coronadan, George Galderisi, who will be speaking about how to be a writer. That's August 23rd. But here to introduce our speaker, Michael Smolens from the San Diego Union Tribune, who will be speaking on the homeless issue and housing. And to introduce him is our own Coronado Roundtable board member, Dave Beed. So Dave, please.
Well, good morning. Thank you all for coming. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Michael Smolens. Michael is a columnist for the San Diego Union Tribune from '92 to 2017. He was the government and politics editor, overseeing local, state, and national political news. As a reporter, he covered politics at all levels, including San Diego City Hall, and did a 4-year stint in the news organization's Sacramento Bureau in the late 1980s. He's a native of Wellesley, Mass, and graduated from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where he majored in English and journalism, and in between that found time to play a pretty good game of hockey. But as he will confess, the age has gotten the better of him and his reflexes aren't what they used to be. So hockey is something in the past, but as a fellow Yankee, I appreciate his playing hockey, and as a graduate of Amherst, that's great.
I think you mean a fellow Red Sox fan.
And a fellow Red Sox fan. Yeah, let's be absolutely clear about that. As Christian alluded, very topical subject, homelessness and housing. If you didn't read the Union Tribune just this morning in the local section, Michael's sidebar column dealt exactly with that. Really, it took a look all the way back into the Wilson administration not Woodrow Wilson, but Pete Wilson, and how Mayor Wilson at that time had fabricated a policy for housing in particular, and how that's morphed over time, and what that looks like now, and what the current mayoral administration has, what they call the Blueprint SD or Blueprint San Diego, and how that's changed and morphed over time, and what that means for us. Likewise, Christian alluded to state actions. You may have read in the paper that Governor Newsom has taken the step of authorizing state government officials to remove housing homeless folks from state property. So what that's going to look like, maybe Michael has some perspective on it, but in any event, let's bring him up and he can give his own perspective on local and state homeless initiatives. Michael.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. And, he mentioned the Wilson administration. I think some of our younger reporters think I do date back to the Woodrow Wilson administration, but I've been very fortunate to work at the Union Tribune for a long time. And just for the record, I do love the Red Sox, but I live and die with the Boston Bruins. So I normally don't do this kind of thing. I mean, I speak, at roundtables and discussions and so forth. And I realize the format here is, for me to speak for a while and then get into the question and answers, which is really my favorite part. I will say, during anything I say, if you have a question or a thought, I hope you don't mind, Chris, but I'd love to hear it even before we get there, because I like a dialogue more than anything else. But I guess to get going, and I can bore myself with my own voice, so I do look forward to use. Plus, I have way too many notes to talk about, so I hope it's not a little disjointed. But I just thought to get going, we'd talk about current events, and it's a daily story, but certainly there's been big news just today and yesterday. And then, maybe just highlighting some of that a little bit, going back to, what are some of the reasons that we do have this homeless problem? I mean, they're multiple, we know that, but I thought, a little history on that front might get us into where we are now and where we're going. And then, sort of segue into, of course, homelessness is so tied to the housing situation in many respects. That's not the only issue, as we know, but I thought we'd head in those areas. And if you want to jump ahead to something else, by all means, let me know. But we mentioned Governor Newsom, sort of ordering the state to ramp up its already, active policy in clearing out homeless encampments on Caltrans property and state property, and they want other agencies to follow what Caltrans is doing. So we'll probably see more of that. I think that our story today talked about, particularly along the riverbeds, which a lot of that is state property, and we know the Caltrans off-ramp areas. What that ultimately means, we don't know. The cities are saying that they don't see to be doing a whole lot different. The city of San Diego, for some time, has had this ordinance of banning homeless encampments in certain areas, and they've taken more of a persuasion approach, with sort of a stick behind it in convincing people to move on. They haven't really made a lot of arrests or citations, as many as people had thought. But the ultimate situation in all this is where do these people go? And all cities are, I think, who was it that just yesterday, passed their own camping ban. There's going to be a lot, I think, tension between jurisdictions of moving people out of theirs and into theirs and back again, because there just isn't the infrastructure to deal with this yet. And I don't know if there will be. So, we can certainly talk about that more as we go along. The other big thing, of course, is across the bay, the mayor, has this hope for this large shelter with 1,000 beds in the Midway district. I'm sorry, what is it? Near the airport. I'm sorry, I forget the exact neighborhood. The 1,000-bed, warehouse conversion that he wants. The lease has come under, as great criticism. It's very expensive by, I think, all experts that know about this stuff have said, and he's running into problems with the city council. What happens next? They've delayed it until September. The odds right now probably aren't that it's going to happen. So, I think as we talk about where we're at and where we may be going, we'll touch on some areas where I think the city might go, if anywhere, if they're just not deadlocked. So anyway, any questions on those by all means, but, and I realize that housing, of course, is a big issue here. I know that Coronado has, had differences with the state and the state pressure to put, more housing, at least in planning documents in Coronado. But, as far as homelessness, you don't have as big of a problem, but Coronado does its share for maybe, it's a small city and doesn't have as big of a problem. But as I believe, and I think is that Mayor Bailey back there? Hi. You do, pay some money to services to, help out people here that need a place to stay. So anyway, sort of, let's get to sort of how we got to here. Like I said, there's so many reasons why, and I probably will miss some, and I'm open to thoughts about that. But a lot of it, of course, has to do with economics. And I'll try not to be looking down at my nose so much, but it's my sort of my safety blanket. I hope you don't mind. There's the lack of affordable housing, low-income housing throughout the state. I mean, the state is very expensive. We also know that there's other issues that are very huge, the mental health issues and substance abuse issues, which aren't strictly housing, but housing is a big aspect of it. And one of my pet peeves has long been that the city of San Diego had a policy decades ago where they decided to move away from the single room occupancy hotels downtown. Now, you've all been here long enough, you know about them. Some of them were not particularly attractive and not very good housing, but they were housing. And over time, they wanted to gentrify downtown, and they basically moved away from them and grandfathered them in, but they went away and were redeveloped. There were a lot of them. There's some still there. That was really one of the lowest rungs of housing available, and did keep a lot of people from becoming homeless. The problem is, and it's more complex than this, but that there was this notion, if not a promise, that they were going to somehow make up for that. There'd be fees from the redevelopment that go into certain funds, and some housing was built, but just not enough to cover it. In the overall, some 10,000 SRO rooms were done away with. And, we do know that the overall region's homeless population is about 10,000. Now, it'd be very simplistic to make that, well, if they just had those 10,000, we wouldn't have 10,000 homeless. That's, of course, not the case. But that kind of housing went away. And, I always thought that was sort of like I don't want to say the original sin, but a big problem in this. Person I know much more knowledgeable than I said, well, but that exacerbated what had been going on. And this I didn't really know that much about, but I don't know if it was in the 50s or 60s, but up until the 60s and 70s, that the whole rental situation was a lot different. The onus was much more on renters than the landlords. And these SROs were part of that, but people could rent places that were really sort of substandard, certainly by today's standard. Oh, yes, sir.
SRO is an acronym for?
I'm sorry, single room occupancy hotels. I apologize. I probably mumbled through that or just skipped over it. Thank you. Yeah, anything that doesn't make sense, by all means, that I say, let me know. Anyway, so they could rent substandard places if the heater wasn't working, window was broken. In some of these buildings and SROs, that there'd be a communal bathroom on a floor, or even in one case, I remember somebody telling me that there was only a bathroom on the first floor of a several story building. Yeah, not great conditions, but again, it was a roof over people's heads. Well-meaning, and I think a good reform movement came through where they, the government largely thought that we needed to improve these standards and set standards. And, for bathrooms, for square footage, of course, disability access, and even parking requirements. Now, some of these went beyond just basic housing and health and safety matters like parking regulations or requirements. As we know, there's a lot of controversy over lifting some of those. Anyway, but, those places were pretty inexpensive. And it's like I said, they sort of segued in with the single room occupancy hotels. They went away over time because these standards, they raised the bar, and that's good. A more a better quality of living. It wasn't extravagant at any means, but as with the subsequent SRO disappearance, a lot of those buildings went away, and there just wasn't, people that couldn't live to that higher bar, afforded that higher bar. There just wasn't, there weren't the policies to, deal with them and take care of them, the kind of housing that was there. Now, again, I'm not suggesting, gee, we should go back to the slum days of certain buildings that were really decrepit, but just that certain efforts of progress sort of forget people that are being left behind. That happens at all walks of life and so forth. So that, was sort of a genesis, and the SRO demise kind of, exacerbated that. What's happening now is kind of interesting in certain respects. I mentioned the parking requirements. People seem to think that they can build for less if they don't have certain requirements, and parking's been a particular one that has been targeted and controversial, saying you don't need 2 spots for a 1-bedroom apartment or whatever the standard had been, and that is changing. It's sort of interesting because certain apartment buildings were very controversial when they did that, because people said, well, nobody's going to want that. And again, it doesn't, demand that you do away with parking, but it does, allow you not to have the kind of parking that was required. Well, it's been a little bit hit or miss, but there's some buildings, there's one in North Park, I think, opened relatively recently, that was controversial because of that. People said, not going to work and so forth. Well, it's 97% occupied, which is really full occupancy. It's on a transit line, and I know the region is not the best in terms of transit, but certain areas are getting better, and that a lot of people sort of kind of gravitated there that either might have just 1 car or no cars and so forth. So I think that you're going to see more of that, and whether it's not the way forward for everybody, but I think the sort of building culture over time didn't allow for that, and they're difficult to do still even now, because the lending situation, the lenders are skeptical of that because they're used to the more guaranteed what happened in the past. But maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. Anyway, like I said, a lot of the sort of the what happened to the people that lived in SROs and those other really substandard units, wasn't really addressed properly and so forth. So, I guess in terms of kind of what's next on homelessness, I mean, I could easily just say who knows and call it a day, but we do know that there's efforts to, on the pure homeless front. Let's talk about that before housing, but let's get back to the Mayor Gloria's shelter situation, big shelter. That's obviously up in the air, and as I said, whether that moves forward or there's just gridlock and they don't do anything. But we face a pretty tough situation, as many of you may know, that some of the shelters, which were supposed to be temporary, are indeed temporary, and they're going to lose several hundred beds of existing shelters by the end of the year, if not sooner. That may be extended. It's been extended in the past, so they do need some replacement. Now, Mayor Gloria said this, 1,000 beds would be in addition to what's here now. So there's an awful lot of replacement that would be needed. Hi, yeah. I would be, I used to know that. I'd have to look it up. I forget how many. Let me just say this, that the occupancy is very high, and as we've repeatedly reported, and several others, news organizations have, that people are continually turned away. I don't know if I thought I saw the 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 people actually that request a bed actually get one. So that was, part of, Rich, I'll get there in just a second, but let me just finish that. That was part of the concern about the city and other cities' camping bans before this Supreme Court ruling, saying, you don't need to provide housing. I mean, the camping bans before were sort of like, you can only move people out of certain areas if there's a bed available. And in a lot of cases, that wasn't the case, but they did have certain exceptions for certain areas. I'm sorry, Mayor Bailey. Oh, no. Look, I'm open to.
There's a
Thank you.
Emergency, temporary shelter beds in the county, and according to last point in time, about 3,800 were occupied, so about 600 to 700 were unoccupied.
Thank you. And by all means,
County or city? County.
he was talking to the county. Yeah. Yeah. I think you may know this, but I think the cities is a little tighter. Of course, and that's part of the problem with the Union Tribune and others. We're so San Diego City centric. There's a lot more going on, although we are reporting a lot more of what's happening. But having Mayor Bailey here is a nice resource. Please speak up, because, like I said, there's a lot you know more than I do, and I'm sure other people on that score. But anyway, I sort of lost. Oh, well. So the region, because the city's facing a big problem. I mean, the city drives so much of what is happening, on homelessness, that I don't know where things are going to happen. Maybe the mayor will get that shelter, but there are problems with that, because the money being used for that, some of it's going to be taken from some other homeless, prevention programs, and people are very concerned about that, because that vouchers, as you know, there are housing vouchers for people, but they're really not able to expand it beyond, I don't think they're going to be taking housing vouchers away from folks, but they aren't expanding it to the people in the need. And I mean, there's a lot of debate over what's the best thing to do, but I think most people agree that preventing homelessness is cheaper than getting people, taking care of people who are homeless and getting them out of homelessness. I think that goes with so many other aspects in life. I mean, we talk about healthcare, and we don't need to get into what's the best healthcare solution, but people going to emergency rooms frequently is a very expensive aspect of that. But I think where there will be more pressure is something along, and I wrote about this not long ago, where the San Diego City Council President Sean Elo Rivera talked about, and the Housing Commission is looking at other areas, smaller shelters, or areas for smaller shelters. Right now, people talk about, well, you can't place them in place because people go berserk, which is true. And understandably, people, don't want them in their neighborhoods for a variety of legitimate reasons. But the reality is there's like 20 shelters, I think, around city, or maybe around the region. That may include some of the safe parking zones and homeless camping areas. So they do exist. And, a lot of the argument for the large shelter is sort of the economy of scale. I mean, we're not just talking about, putting people up for the night, but there's a lot of services that people need. There's, feeding people. There's, like I said, a lot of mental health services, and frankly, a lot of sort of advice to try to get people back on their feet, not just people that are having, mental health problems or substance abuse problems. So they are expensive. But the Housing Commission is looking at particularly downtown San Diego. As we know, commercial properties in downtown areas, there's a lot of vacancies, and some people think there's some big opportunities. And I was told just recently, because at Elo Rivera's request, the Housing Commission was starting to look in that regard, not abandoning where the mayor is going. I mean, that's going to sort itself out, and the Housing Commission will have to, follow the direction of the city council. But that, for instance, there was one property, I forget how many stories, that was available for $4 million that had the potential of being transformed into a shelter for probably, a few hundred people if they wanted to do that. Now, a lot of these properties probably aren't going to be suitable because they just, the conversion or the structure, design, whatever, wouldn't allow for it. But that's one area where they're looking. Yeah.
Has there been any thought about converting remaining barracks at NTC?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not NTC or Liberty Station, but right next door by the airport, the H barracks, the old Navy barracks. That, I mean, before the mayor came up with this other proposal off Kettner Boulevard, Kettner and Vine, they were talking about, again, a temporary thing for 600, 700, 800 people at H barracks, which is just sort of not to the, I guess, to the west of the airport, but just to the east across that channel from Liberty Station. People there didn't like it, of course. And when this other proposal came up, which really was sort of kept under wraps quite a bit. I mean, suddenly there was, a deal on the table the mayor presented. They moved away from the H barracks shelter, but they're talking about like a 200 lot safe parking area where people, as you know, can basically live out of their cars. It's not a great situation, but at least it gives people a place to go, but that's run into some opposition and likely lawsuits. So nothing's easy. I mean, there are no easy solutions, but anyway, that I think gets to your question. But getting back to other aspects or alternatives to this big shelter is, like I said, the individual other different properties. And we all know that it's very difficult for logistical and political reasons to site a shelter. A lot of neighborhood opposition, and like I say, absolutely legitimate. But I think that some people are saying that governments have to be more aggressive. People might not like it. I'm not endorsing this, but that if you back off everywhere, people don't want a shelter, you won't have any shelters. And some people will argue that when they put in shelters or a camping site, for instance, people are always saying, there's going to be trouble, et cetera, and so forth. And it's more anecdotal because I don't know anybody's done a real analysis, but I think Council Member Jen Campbell has said, look, the ones in Balboa Park, people were saying that you just haven't had the problems. Are there problems? Of course. The difficulty is what kind of problems were there before those areas suddenly housed, a few hundred people. So I don't know that people will ever get over that, but this is probably a horrible analogy, but traffic engineers think we got to put a stoplight somewhere, and people don't like that. Well, that stoplight's probably going to go there. They will get public feedback, but unless there's a really good argument not for it, that's going to happen. That's going to be a tough road to get. If the city needs a handful of more shelters, it's going to be pretty tough. But I guess the idea, and some people thought the H barracks was a place that, okay, there's no real residences right around there. Well, Liberty Station isn't far away, but I think they thought there was some separation there, and it was a little bit secluded, and frankly on a bus line, so it had a lot of the prospects. But again, these things are very difficult. One of the other things in the Elo Rivera proposal, which is pretty intriguing, is let me get back to other sites. I mentioned commercial properties. Cities around the state have been doing conversions of motels and hotels if they work. Again, they're not all are suitable. They're expensive, but this whole situation is expensive. But at least those are areas. Be there just a second. Let me finish this.
It's over there, Mike.
Oh.
Yeah, when you're done, I have a question.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can. But at least as far as sort of the impact, those are places that have dealt with a lot of people coming and going and people living there. So it's not like, putting something in a residential neighborhood. How much those are available, I don't know. But, let's face it, take El Cajon Boulevard. Now, I'm not denigrating El Cajon Boulevard, but there are some motels that are not necessarily, they often use for less than what they're supposed to. Let's say prostitution and drugs. Not all the rooms and so forth, but I just sort of wonder, and we'll see if they move in that direction. Are the owners and the neighbors, is a place that houses formerly homeless people more advantageous than what's there? So maybe those are opportunities. Again, I don't know, but I'm sorry.
From the Zoom,
Oh,
to what degree did a change in assistance to mental illness in the early 1960s affect the homeless issue?
well, that's a good question, and it had an effect. Some people think, again, there's so much here that's easy to be simplistic about, and that was before my time. But as we know that again, it sort of, I'll make the analogies to SROs. It was a good idea, but they didn't follow through. And what the idea was during the Reagan administration, it wasn't just Ronald Reagan. Many legislators thought that these big mental institutions, and they were not, in some cases, good places. And they thought that that's not a good way of care. Let's close those down. Let's get more community-based areas. Well, talk about putting just a pure homeless shelter in a community, putting, a small area, a smaller facility that with people with mental illness problems is controversial. And that didn't come to pass as much. So there was a lot more of those people on the street. I can't make the continuum as to what that impact had to, half a century more later, but I know that was one of the issues. again, I really caution that my knowledge is limited. I wasn't here, and some people say, well, there's more to it than that. But I think we also talked about some of those issues in terms of how the rental dynamic changed and so forth. Dave.
Michael, do you have any sense or any knowledge that there's an effort on the part of the city or county to measure the efficacy of like the campsites over by Balboa Hospital? I mean, I know they're supposed to have all the services there and all that, and which is the end goal is to get folks back into, get them rehabilitation as necessary and get them in housing. But that campsite hasn't gotten any smaller.
Right.
And they talk about it, but they never talk about what the success rate is of that program, that model.
There's growing discussion of doing that. The governor has been outspoken that, we spent how many tens, hundreds of billions of dollars over the years, and, it's just getting worse. Of course, he's been governor for a good part of that. Well, but he, wants the locals to deal with that. And Mayor Bailey, by all means, weigh in on this, but it's, my understanding that the first thing they want to do is say, okay, at least how do you account for your money? I mean, this is, for years, there's just not been even that accountability in some cases as to, how it's spent, is it being spent properly? Then there's the real issue that you're talking about in terms of, okay, what is the effectiveness? And, I mean, I don't know that you can put a pure business model on this, but to a degree, okay, you have to analyze, what's working and what isn't. And I think that there's been a complaint that there just hasn't been that kind of analysis. And, what you change to if it isn't working, I don't know. But we do know that, a lot of money is being spent and homelessness continues to grow. So something's not working. But I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Mayor Bailey, but is that something you'd like to add on?
I'll just chime in real quick. The state recently released an audit report as of last year where they evaluated the effectiveness of some of these programs. And what the conclusion was, in a nutshell, that it was essentially impossible to measure how effective they were, in large part because there were 9 different state agencies that were administering these funds. And each of those 9 different state agencies, they were all operating disjointly according to the audit report. We also have the counties and cities, which oftentimes operate disjointly from one another. And I hate to say it, but it's true. There is zero coordination between the regional task force on homelessness and the county of San Diego and the city of San Diego and the surrounding cities. And so if someone bounces from one shelter to another shelter to another shelter, it's nearly impossible to keep track of them with the existing system. So in short, the answer to your question is it's entirely unknown based on all of it.
Yeah, and whether they get that, let me just sort of capsulize, because I have the mic for the Zoom people, but Mayor Bailey just was saying that they've there's a state audit trying to analyze this, and that it's impossible. There's just a plethora of state agencies involved, several local agencies that don't talk to each other, but at least the discussion is going that okay, how do we rectify that? I mean, you look at some other areas. I mean, everybody holds Houston up as a great example on homelessness, and they've done a lot of good jobs. Houston's a different place. Cost of living is much different than here and so forth. But they have a much more, I think, I don't know if centralized is the right word, but they don't have, all these interests in the homeless service area, whether government or nonprofits. It's much more unified, and they've shown progress. I'm sorry, there was a.
We generally lump the homeless into subgroups. Those that are substance abuse, those that don't want to be homeless but they can't help it, and those with mental issues. Can you comment on specific programs designed for subgroups? And to mention what was just said, these separate siloed agencies compete for money and that for budget. That's why they're siloed. But are there specific programs aimed at managing these subgroups?
Yes, you heard in the tone of my voice that it's a complicated question. The County of San Diego, to its credit, and you could previously criticize them, has ramped up, mental health services and outreach and so forth, as the city of San Diego has. I mean, quite frankly, the county, talked to past people. I want to call him old friend, City Councilman Larry Sterling, don't know if any of you remember him, but he and others that were, served back in the 60s and 70s said, the county has never really just, taken much control of the homelessness situation. And, they're the Health and Human Services agencies and so forth. So there are that. You can't really separate a lot of things out. I mean, some people raise the question, how many people that don't have mental health issues develop them because they become homeless, which is another matter. But there does seem to be, I don't want to say easier or low-hanging fruit, but there are people, like you mentioned, that don't want to be homeless and can't help it. And a lot of prevention programs can hopefully keep them in housing. One of the things that I'll be there just a second to, but again, Shaniela Rivera talked about something that's been happening more and more is, and it's pretty controversial, direct grants to people with no strings attached. It's called, guaranteed income in some places, and you've all read about that. Well, in some cases, it's worked. And, there've been certain studies that show, people, yes, some people use the money frivolously. A lot don't. They do it on basic things and, whether housing or food and so forth. And they had some experience during the flooding, in the southern part of the city and, everywhere, but particularly the city of San Diego, where some money was made available for people. And, not only were there no strings attached, but there also weren't the requirements of like a housing voucher or things like that, that some people figured out what to do without, they could rent a room that just might be difficult to do under the other processes. So that's gaining some currency. Again, it's pretty controversial. But what I'm getting at is that, yes, whether I think there are some efforts to not separate out, but to distinguish, okay, what are not to say, let's take care of the easy ones first. Frankly, you don't want to do that, but that, one of the arguments against the big shelter is that, it's an amazing amount of money per bed, per night, per month, but there's a lot of services wrapped up in there. I mean, do you more, kind of separate out the people with serious problems and have more areas for those? That's happening to some degree. I think Father Joe's Villages has, closed a homeless shelter and putting it to a substance abuse kind of situation. But anyway, I'm sort of rambling.
Michael, we're going to start using the mic.
Okay.
So that everybody can hear the questions.
Yeah. Mayor, I hope I encapsulated what you said. Okay. I didn't want to do that for anybody.
Hi. I know you said you would talk about so-called affordable housing, which I think in California, the cost to build quote affordable housing is just outrageous. When you have the price per unit of these places, it's crazy. But along those lines, I was wondering about if people have thought about bringing back the SROs. I think it would be more economically advantageous for a developer to have what we used to call tenement buildings, where it's mostly bedrooms, maybe one bathroom per floor. Every unit does not need a kitchen. Every unit does not need a bathroom. It seems that might be more economically advantageous and could shelter more people. Is there serious talk about bringing those back?
There is, and thank you for the question. That sort of segues, I sort of had certain segments and they might not have been in the best order, but, sort of the housing, which there's more to homelessness than housing, but that is really the big issue for a lot of folks. And certain cities, San Diego, at least in what is it? It's, housing 2.0, I forget whatever, but there was a component of, trying to encourage, have incentives for SRO type buildings that have that. I've seen some articles about, I think even in South Bay, I don't, the term communal living is, has a certain image that might give the wrong impression, but that there are common areas and even some common cooking areas. And, not every room has a bathroom. While that can sound a little bit like a, traveling hostel, that can appeal to some people for the right price. Everything's still so expensive. I mean, there are so many regulations beyond what even if the city stripped a lot of what they do, there are state regulations. But that sort of gets to the, how do you get affordable housing? And that's a question I don't necessarily have the answer to. I don't know if anybody does, because there are so many built-in costs of construction, labor, materials out of sight. Interest rates on all that right now are still tough. And it's California. And the land, I don't know if I mentioned that. However, that as I said to this knowledgeable person, I said, well, you know, you always hear people saying, well, you can't build your way out of this, you know, with density. And he said, well, really the question should be flipped. Can you get your way out of this without density? And he said, no. And, you know, I understand that's very, very controversial. I mean, you know, people like a lot of what's in their neighborhoods and don't want more housing. And I understand that. But I think that beyond that, areas where we're building more luxury apartments, you may see more of a focus on trying to groove the incentives more towards middle and lower income housing. Some people are building this and saying they're making money, but largely because, you know, with certain relaxations of requirements like parking, again, they don't have to do that, but that allows them to do that. And they're slowly seeing a market for that. Does the lending in the markets sort of catch up to that? I don't know. And it's not for everybody, but you know, it might be for people that you know, are in the middle to lower income for a bit. So that's one area. And as I get to my cheat sheet.
We have one more question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sure. Christian.
Michael, there are a fair number of college students that are homeless. They probably live in their cars, and I have a feeling that the local communities consider that a college problem, and the colleges consider them homeless like the general population that are homeless and not their problems. At a minimum, I would think they are well-educated, fairly well-educated, intelligent pool to be able to, and that they have the experience to help in potentially helping solve some of the problems of homelessness. So the question is, are they being addressed as a homeless population in the media, in local government, or anywhere?
Well, I think it's both sort of. We had a story about how many thousands of units UC San Diego has gotten approval for building from the UC Regents for students there. I know, I think City College even, correct me somebody if I have this wrong, but that they have started targeting some housing in their realm. I mean, you know, it's a matter, it's a societal problem, et cetera, but I think that the universities and colleges need to be a big part of that. You know, UC San Diego seems to be moving in that direction. Of course, that's also part of their just, you know, expansive growth. I mean, that university has been continuing to grow for decades. Doesn't really answer your question, but you know, I think you were saying that, is it, you know, a homeless problem? Is it a college university problem? It's both, but there, you know, in this case, it really should, you know, the responsibility, or a lot of it, should be on the colleges and universities to provide that. City College is a little different aspect because, you know, that was never sort of a, I mean, that's a commuting college, as well, San Diego State was originally. So they need to work on the housing, and if they have land to do it.
Michael, next question.
Sure.
You started your talk with the suggestion that homes are not the whole problem. These people being homeless is a description of them, but getting a home is not a solution for most of them. It's a criminal problem. They're vagrants. It's a mental health problem. They need help. But when they are homeless, they join a village, and it takes a village, as Hillary said. It is a village that has a commerce in it, prostitution, drug selling and buying and using, and protection. So what are we even talking about?
Well, I'm not sure. Is there a question there? I mean, no. All you're saying, it does happen.
Wherever you put them in a temporary place, residency is 97%, but it's changing all the time because they have to get back to the village to get what they want. So get them off the street in Borrego Springs. San Bernardino and Riverside counties have more vacant space than they do populated space. Put them out there.
Well, you know, those kinds of proposals are there at Sunbreak Ranch. You know, a lot of people like it. That's the, you know, there's not a real site. It was proposed for Otay Mesa or on the Miramar property, vacant property there. It's gained a lot of attention, even gotten some national attention. But some people don't think that that'll happen. First of all, that just logistically, the Navy's not going to give the property. They've said they're not going to do it and so forth. I'm just, no, your point is well taken, but you know, it's tough to do. And also some people think that, you know, putting places so remote, the services and needs there are so difficult to get to, that is a problem. Again, I'm not supporting this one way or another, but you asked why. And, you know, ultimately it's, I mean, we don't like to suggest everything's a political issue, but there are differences of opinion on what to do. You know, there have been some suggestions that, you know, some longtime former council members said they should have, you know, they were talking about turning H barracks into sort of a camp and certain requirements and, you know, kind of really push them to get jobs and people to get jobs and so forth. It's a huge problem. I mean, you know, we've all seen people out on the street and probably seen drug use on the street. I have, you know, I'm not talking about that then isn't a solution, but I think that there are different levels and reasons for homelessness, and that is certainly one of them. You know, how you determine those folks that are problematic, like you say, in a different way from folks that just need, you know, somewhat of a help is an issue. I don't think that answers your question, or certainly by the look satisfies you, but nonetheless.
Michael, next question. And those of you raising your hands up, I'm going one at a time. So we've seen societal change in Coronado, from the Coronado of youth. Okay, where Coronado of the youth, you had single family houses with backyards and front yards and children playing all throughout the neighborhoods and things like that. And things have changed. We've had societal change. Okay, how much of it is going to be societal change all over San Diego in total? Where, you know, we've got other areas where they're all bewailing their single family houses are going to be ripped apart. Big 4 or 5 story buildings going to be put in.
Things can change, not to, you know, use that word, I'm not throwing it back at you, but the direction of the state and local governments is to, you know, do that. I don't know how, you know, how high those buildings, but certainly, you know, from, you know, the sort of backdooring policy of accessory dwelling units to other issues. But there's clearly, and it sort of surprised me, and frankly, I'm not sure it was the best approach, but it sort of surprised me how very early on these single family home neighborhoods came under, you know, specific focus. And I think that I think former Mayor Kevin Faulkner, what was the bill, SB 50, that you know, had certain, you know, densification and so forth. And he opposed that particular one because he thought it went too far into those neighborhoods. Just, it was a political problem, but, you know, and also a, you know, a neighborhood quality problem. But I'm getting there, that the focus needed to be, and it took a while for this legislature to do this. Okay, you've got these commercial areas that are changing. There were restrictions on building housing there for a long time, and they finally started lifting those. It's still difficult to do from what I've talked to developers, but, you know, like some of the commercial areas downtown, are these areas ripe for, and those are on major thoroughfares. So, you know, should you be building more there? But yeah, they, you know, and I used the term in today's column that okay, is this social engineering? Are they trying to, you know, change certain neighborhoods to diversify and things like that? And some people think that's a laudable goal. Obviously, some people don't. You know, I mean, let's face it. You know, we talk about the, you know, how white certain neighborhoods are, but neighborhoods have become more diverse. I mean, I mentioned Mira Mesa, as a matter of fact, as part of the whole growth management thing back in Pete Wilson days. It's a large Filipino community there. So, you know, I don't know that enough taken into account the people that have sort of risen to you know, that ability to live in those neighborhoods. Suddenly, how are they going to feel that the change in character and density of their neighborhoods coming in? You know, for a long time, the political onus, not onus, but the political thrust seemed to be to, you know, avoid that, to protect that. It sort of changed. Will that, you know, change again and, you know, go back to more protecting these areas? I don't know, but that's clearly the political direction.
Next question.
If you build it, they will come. I mean, there's nothing to stop the homeless people from coming in the state. And I was wondering, do we have any idea what percentage of the homeless are like mental problems?
Oh.
Homeless problems, or you know, what percentage?
Well, I'll start out with your beginning premise, and the other ones I don't quite know, but I can address it. You know, there are people that come from out of state who are homeless, and there are some programs, I don't know how broad they are, that, you know, that to help these people, you know, get transportation, buses back to where they might have family and stuff. But part of the annual point in time homeless count, you know, they interview a lot of these people, if not all of them, and, you know, I think 75% have said they've become homeless when they've been in San Diego, that they didn't arrive here and become homeless. Now, you know, I don't know how long, you know, people had been here and so forth. So there's a bit of this notion that, you know, a lot of people, homeless people, come here. That's maybe true to a degree, but I don't think as much as people think. Warm weather climates, moderate climates like this are certainly going to be attractive to folks, you know, whether homeless or not. As far as the percentage of mental health and substance abuse, I can't recall, but I remember in one study, it surprised me how high it was. Again, I think this is sort of self-described in you know, in surveying people who are homeless. A lot of it, they said, in some cases, was because they became homeless and developed issues with a mental health or substance abuse. But I would hate to put a percentage because I can't recall, but it was surprisingly high to me, which, you know, addresses some of the problems that fellow mentioned about how you deal with people that, you know, it isn't just homelessness, it's a lot more. Mayor Bailey.
Hi, Michael. I can answer that question.
Thank you very much.
So the state of California distinguishes homeless population between general homeless population and what are known as chronically homeless. Chronically homeless are the ones we typically think about when we think of the individuals living on the streets. Chronically homeless are defined as those that have been homeless 4 or more times in a given year, or homeless for several consecutive months. And Michael's correct. Most of the data we have on the homeless population is all self-reported, so you have to take everything with a grain of salt. But the chronically homeless, self-reported as being about 80%, having 80% substance abuse and a slightly percentage of mental health disorders. Although I'm sure, as we can all imagine, someone that is suffering from a mental health episode is probably not the best person to self-diagnose themselves. And I don't mean that in jest. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. But according to the self-reported data, it's about 80% for the chronically homeless.
Thank you.
Much less so for non-chronically homeless.
Glad you're here, Mayor. You're bailing me out.
Michael, we have a question from your sponsor right here.
Hi, Michael, don't mean to hijack the meeting.
No.
And
Please do.
That housing is tied directly to homelessness, but without even considering the homelessness, is the market solution that they appear to be approaching, is that going to resolve our housing, the housing costs or the rental costs? I mean, the feeling is that, well, if we just build a whole lot more houses, the prices will come down and it'll be that much more affordable. But are there structural issues with the economy in California in particular that are just too difficult to overcome, that building more houses is just not going to get us there?
Well, I won't pretend to be an expert in that larger sense, but we know California is very expensive, and the short answer is I don't think it's just a market solution. That's part of it. Like I said, that you know, a lot of people, well, you just can't build your way out of this. You know, you can't put skyscrapers everywhere, here, there, and everywhere. That's going to do it. Some people maintain, the supply and demand isn't really the issue, that it just increase, of course, it again gets very politicized. All this just makes developers more money and so forth. Well, first of all, on the supply and demand aspect, that my colleague Phil Molnar at the Union Tribune covers housing, and he talked earlier this year about how there are a lot of apartments coming online this year, and he already noted that some plateauing of rents, maybe even a little drop here and there. I think it was at the Times of San Diego today had a story I didn't get to read, just saw the headline, where rents are down in San Diego. So I think that there's some legitimacy to that there's a shortage of various kinds of housing in San Diego, and certainly that kind in apartments. I saw another story where the waiting list or the request list for available apartments, you have multiple people seeking that at the same time. So that is an issue. But we talk about part of the housing ethos is to allow developers more units in return for like 10-15% or so of affordable or rent restricted units. I don't know that that's going to cut it. I think that increasingly, let's face it, part of this is going to be public subsidies one way or another. I know that's not necessarily popular, but between that and whether government can start using more of its land and whether it should. I mean, I remember I had a very animated discussion with somebody when I used the term public housing. Like me, he was from the East Coast and said, "Oh, yeah, you look at those places that you see in the Bronx and in certain parts of Boston and stuff. They were horrible." Well, I think hopefully those mistakes wouldn't be made, but I think there's going to have to be some intelligent way to infuse public funds, because it's costing the public a lot of money now. I think again, it's a pretty sensitive aspect, but I don't know that the market itself will do it. But I think that there are things, that sort of kind of gets back to where things may go. I think that local governments may start, like I said, doing more incentives for those kinds of, middle and lower income housing. They are trying to, and say they are. I think that there might be a weighing of amenities and a place with the more luxurious amenities, if you will, versus more sparse housing that people might not need, the pool and the workout room. Right now it's sort of and this is again a very crude way to put it. It's much more nuanced, but to provide the affordable housing in these bonuses, a lot of developers say, well, we got to build these higher end ones. So, that creates that people talk about the missing middle. But anyway, so no, I don't think the market's going to do it just by itself, but I think a lot can be done in conjunction. It's multiple things. I'm not the best economic expert at all.
Next question, Michael.
Wondering, all the illegal immigrants crossing the border, imagine that, or it's the homeless situation. Often wonder, where do these people go? Where do they live? How do they go grocery shopping and all that?
Well, I mean, I don't know. That's a broad question. Yes, there obviously it's a big problem, and we talked about, should we talk about immigration here, and you folks had a previous one, but housing, folks, is an issue. It's been an issue in San Diego where we've had to spend county money to provide places for folks. Again, this is sort of simplistic. San Diego, I think, is to a degree is somewhat of a pass-through area that a lot of illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, whatever term you want to use, do come here and stay here, but move on to LA and other cities. It's not to say they folks don't stay here, and obviously they're encouraged to move on. But I don't where they shop and stuff like that. I think wherever they sort of land and so forth. But it's certainly part of the problem, and we hear about it in other realms in a very heightened rhetorical way on both sides. But
Next question.
yeah.
Hi, Michael. Do you have any idea what the success rate of rehab with alcohol, drugs, and mental illness is?
Sorry, I just don't. Sorry. I hope they didn't hold me up to be such an expert on anything. Mayor Bailey, you probably know.
All right, next question.
Thank you for being here. In the news and so forth, I've seen that there are certain criteria to come into the housing. The pets, or can't smoke or whatever. Have you noticed there's something overall that makes it harder for people to get into this housing?
Well, if they smoke or have pets, certainly, I don't mean to be too glib on that, but yeah, I mean, that I think has been a growing issue and is, I don't know if that necessarily keeps people out of housing. I will say that, sometimes when people are resistant to go into shelters, it's because certain restrictions are on shelters. I mean, let's face it, and Mayor Bailey talked about, there's chronic homeless, some folks just don't want to, go inside or, for whatever reason, whether just, their predilection, their mental health, whatever. But in some cases, it's a pets issue, and some facilities do allow pets. Some cases that, it has to do with, the family mix and things like that. As far as apartments, that's just, it's sort of a extension of where society has gone. I mean, you can't smoke in restaurants anymore. I was sort of surprised that, okay, it's one thing that if you couldn't smoke in common areas in apartments, but now because of the airflow, some are suggesting that smoking in one apartment might affect another, so they're disallowing it in some. I'm sure that's a barrier for some people. Yes.
This doesn't particularly go to the housing issue, but having been in social services as a career, it is really difficult to wend your way through the network or lack thereof to broker services for homeless.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a lot of persistence on the part of the homeless or unhoused person to wend their way through maybe 9 providers.
Well, and that sort of gets back to the broader situation that Mayor Bailey was talking about with the state audit. There's so many, entities involved, and that's why, the talk about the sort of no strings attached grants. Again, people can use those not in the best ways, but that allows for a lot, quicker and frankly innovative action that not services so much, but I don't know, can you even through the Housing Commission, voucher, can you rent a room? If somebody has, room available and, that grant just puts you high enough into an area to do that. So yeah, those are huge issues. How you deal with those, I don't know. You got to somehow streamline it, but I'll be right there in a second. But I remember years ago when, homelessness really came back into focus, a fellow reporter, did a story on it, and he was interviewing a homeless fellow, and he said, "Well, have you tried to, get help and so forth?" And he sort of referenced back then there was a gauntlet. Hopefully, they're making it easier, but he said, "Hey, I'm trying to eat, and I have to spend my time trying to, find eat and so forth. I can't spend time, waiting, someplace to get to, talk about it."
You mentioned earlier about it's hard to account for all the money that California is spending. There's $24 billion. One of your journalistic colleagues have done an investigation into where this money went to, but it seems like $24 billion and nobody knows where it went, and we still have the same housing problem. It can't all be for some really good reasons.
Right. Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that's been done on individual levels. I haven't seen anything quite statewide level. Whether the implication, whether it's, kind of nefariously spent, I don't know, could be. I think the larger issue is, has it been wisely spent that on efforts and so forth. But, there's just one thing I wanted to get to before, I don't know what our next move is, but let me, we were talking about certain things about housing. This kind of goes to today's market thing. Something that I've just become recently fascinated with is the notion of a sort of a single stairwell scenario. Okay, I didn't know this, but in California and cities across the country, you need 2 stairwells in a building taller than 3 stories for fire safety reasons. And that is a decades, if not generations old standard, and understandably, but some people in the know, and it's sort of controversial, that say, look, the materials that they use today and the sprinkler system technology and other defenses, that it's just not as much of an issue, that you're not going to get the kind of burning tower involvement like of yesteryear. I'm sure that can be proven wrong, but it's more individual units. And the state has passed legislation to start focusing on, do we really need this in all cases? And what that could mean is sort of interesting, because there's just a lot of properties that are oddly shaped or just too small, that with 2 stairwells, it just doesn't pencil out because of the size of the building. If you take that away, you can either build more units or even make it a little more attractive with courtyard or something like that. I just find that fascinating. It's not, again, there's no one big solution, but that's just sort of an interesting thing, like, I'd never even heard of that and thought of that. And if you're interested, frankly, Google my friend Andrew Bowen from KPBS. He did a story, I think in January. The city had sort of a workshop on it. And, again, I don't know enough about this. The fire marshal was opposed. It wasn't proposed legislation, just discussion about such a thing. I think the International Firefighters Union didn't like it. So, those people know a lot. But anyway, I just wanted to get that out there because I just found that, just one of those things that, I talked about how are we is there sort of a past culture in a lot of housing that either needs to be changed or certainly is being looked at change, as we all know, in the densification era.
I think it's time.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Well, thank you all very much. I knew this was a knowledgeable crowd and I was a little intimidated, but I appreciate it.
Yes, wonderful talk, and very interesting subject. We thank you very much for